Hi, I'm Amber Schrader, Executive Director of Badgers United, and you are listening to The Flagship. Today we are joined by Senator Dale Kooyenga, who represents the 5th District. He serves as the chair of the Senate Committee on Universities, Technical Colleges, Children, and Families, and we look forward to hearing his perspective on the state of higher education in Wisconsin. Well, thank you for joining us today, Senator.
Thanks for having me.
Before we dive into some questions about UW-Madison, I want to give our listeners the chance to learn a little bit about you. Can you tell us about your district?
My district is the best district in the state of Wisconsin. It represents Wauwatosa and Brookfield and New Berlin and Elm Grove and West Allis and parts of Milwaukee. So it's a very diverse district as far as political opinions. If you're on the eastern side of Tosa, there's blocks where you would swear you were in Madison. And then if you're in western New Berlin or western Brookfield, you'd very much know that you're in a conservative area. So it's a great district. I really enjoyed it. Home to a lot of healthcare companies or healthcare entities like Medical College of Wisconsin, Aurora Healthcare, and Freighter and Children's Hospital. My wife started work yesterday. A lot of manufacturing. So it's a great district.
It is a great district. It's a great area. I think people probably don't know you're a CPA. How does that help shape how you view your role as a senator?
Yeah, so I've been a certified public accountant for 20 years. I started off at the accounting firm KPMG, and really great experience because it's an international firm. And in that role, being an international firm in a small city, I was able to do audits and get into the details of healthcare entities and financial services and not-for-profits. Did the audit Milwaukee Public Schools and the city of Milwaukee. So really comparing that to my MBA, being a CPA and working with those companies at Deep Dive is the best MBA you could have, and learning those public policy issues and how those different industries interact with government. It was a really great background for getting into office.
That's awesome. So it gives you the real nitty-gritty side of when you look at a policy, you really look at the financial implications. Yeah,
and just like a lot of different industries, they have their own lingo, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're talking about a different industry, you're talking about DISH in healthcare, if you're talking about unencumbered reserves or whatever it is, there's different languages and different issues that come up with this industry. So having that broad background in different industries really is helpful when I'm trying to address the issue. There's a certain amount of time I don't have to spend in getting comfortable on the front end because I've already been there in the private sector.
That's really helpful. So you are a senator, you're a CPA, you are also serve in the U.S. Army Reserves.
Yes.
And you served in Iraq. Tell us about how that shapes your perspective.
Well, I ran for office in 2010, and that was on the heels of a deployment in Iraq in 2008. And although I was trained as a military intelligence officer, what happened when I got in the theater is at the time of the surge under General David Petraeus. And really what people think of the surge was more troops. And yes, that was true. It wasn't a huge increase in troops. It was a huge change in strategy. And so it really was more of let's put our rifles down and try to build a country, win hearts and minds. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the crux of it. And essentially they were like, yep, that's great. You're military intelligence. What do you do in the civilian world? And I was like, well, I'm a certified public accountant. I have my MBA. And they're like, perfect. Why don't you work with local businesses and try to get businesses up and running? So I gave micro grants to women in burqas for beauty salons, worked with companies to create hand-woven carpets that were sold to create jobs. That's a podcast within itself of what I did in Iraq and lessons learned. But in regards to your question, what happened was I got back from that experience. I lost a friend there, knew of some other soldiers that weren't able to come home, and really had me reflecting on public policy at the time. We have the lowest number of veterans in office at the state and the federal level that we've ever had in our country's history. And I think that is to the detriment of compromise. I think it's to the detriment of getting things done. And I think that all comes with a lack of perspective as far as our values, our principles, and knowing that as Democrats and Republicans and Libertarians and everything in between, is that as one, we fight as a country, as when you're overseas, when you're in Baghdad, we have more in common than we don't have in common. And taking those ethics and those principles back here, I really thought we need more people in office that saw things that way.
Well, I could spend a lot of time talking to you about that, and I want to thank you for your service. But we're really here today to talk about UW-Madison, and one of the things we're most excited about with the timing of having you here is that there's a hearing coming up on a tuition bill that would essentially lead to maybe the thaw of this longstanding tuition freeze. It's on January 22nd. Can you talk about why you think this is the right time for that discussion?
Well, I mean, I think it's always time. I'm not one that says no to public hearings. So if you look at the committee that I'm in charge of, which is universities, colleges, and families, I've almost always err on the side of let's have a hearing, let's talk about it. For those that don't know how the process works, you have a public hearing, and the next step is you exec it, you move it out of committee before it gets to one of the floors. And so this is the first step of that, to have a discussion as far as where are we at? This was back in 2013, and in 2013, that was on the heels of Act 10. And after Act 10, we heard a lot about how the cuts to the university were really hurting the university. And I'm one who is sympathetic to that because I think that the university in general across the whole system, but in particular here in Madison, UW-Madison, is a key component of so many different parts of education, our business community, and our public policy. And it pained me to hear that those cuts, which were paired with different flexibilities, were hurting the university. So we actually started looking at the details of the books at UW, like what is going on there. And when we started that process, we actually asked some questions that apparently were never asked before, because it revealed that there was nearly $1 billion in funds that were not disclosed to the public. Now, there's a weird group of people really upset about that. The public employee unions that were negotiating, that were not aware of that money, were upset about it. Taxpayers were upset. Students were upset because at the time they were talking about 5-6% tuition increases, and they were increasing tuitions for decades at a rate that was significantly larger than inflation. So it came out that there was this huge amount of reserves there. We are now approaching almost a decade of tuition freeze. I think at some point in time, we need to talk about, okay, what is the appropriate level of tuition? So we could talk more about that as this goes back and forth. But I don't think that school should be free. And I also feel that schools should be affordable for those whose parents don't have degrees. And so there's a balance there. And I think that balance should be discussed because it has huge implications for individuals, families, businesses, our state as a whole. So we need to talk about it.
Yeah, we agree. And I think, though, and maybe you can comment on your perspective this from the legislature side, do you believe that the reserves that were found, essentially, are misunderstood?
In what sense?
In that many of them were slated for things. They weren't just there that could be used or drawn upon. They were slated to certain projects, et cetera. Yeah,
I mean, I think you could say, like, in whole, there's not $1 billion of cash sitting around. I think the problem, and I think that was one of the things that got away from the messaging from some of my colleagues on the Republican side, was I wasn't outraged that there was money there. I think it was good. In fact, there was a lot of things to highlight why it was the success of the system, why the money was there. It was there because there was a lot of entrepreneurial ideas as far as going back to night school for people that are already out there and were past the traditional college years. And that was good from a business perspective. It was good because Act 10 was working. It was creating savings and efficiencies. So I was never excited about the amount of money. I was upset about the lack of transparency. It was a transparency issue. So now what has happened is there's been considerable efforts to organize where that money's at, what is actually used for certain functions, and what is actually truly a reserve. And so I think it's good they have a reserve. I think they should have a reserve. And all things considered, I mean, I think that I wouldn't recommend that they go well below the reserves that they're at now. So that's part of the discussion we'll have at the public hearing.
Yeah, we agree. So what are you hoping to hear in this hearing? What are you hoping you'll hear from folks that come speak there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm leery of a just very simple conversation as far as, this is why the public hearing may be a little long, as far as raise tuition or keep tuition the same. I want to hear about innovation in the system. I want to hear about that balance as far as what is the proper balance. You know, I kind of lean more towards keeping the overall tuition affordable, but having more financial aid so you could flex so that, you know, I'm the son of a garbage man and a floor nurse. I'm the first one in my family to ever go to school. When I graduated high school, they said, you're on your own for school. And so I looked at my checkbook, and so I went to a 2-year college. And then after that, I went to a 4-year college here in Wisconsin. But I made decisions of where I went to college in part based on my checkbook. That's the balance I want to hit. I mean, there's a lot of innovations out there that are, you know, right now there's innovations out there is where you could pay a portion of your salary going forward. Mm-hmm. And there's different businesses that will sponsor degrees. So I want to hear at the public hearing about different innovative ideas, not just about increasing the tuition, what other vehicles there are out there to control tuition, and how we compare to other states. Now, I think there's too much emphasis put on that. I see a lot of charts as a legislature saying, okay, well, here's all the Big Ten schools, and here's how we compare to those, and aren't we a great value? And I was like, absolutely. I mean, I would argue, and I'm biased, that UW-Madison offers the best value per dollar of any Big Ten school. With that being said, I think there's a danger in always looking at a chart and saying, well, if we're the lowest tuition, which I don't know if we are or not, but if we're the lowest tuition, then we should be the middle of the pack, because it creates this revolving door where other legislators in other states are looking at the same. And what we've seen, if you're talking about the frustration with the middle class, you've seen housing costs that has significantly gone up, healthcare costs have significantly gone up, and the cost of education. And so we as policymakers have a responsibility to really get to the root of that and say, well, when there was a significant amount of money coming from the state to UW, with that money or without that money, there has been significant increases in tuition. Why is that? And what's the light at the end of the tunnel?
So I think what's important to talk about here for those that are listening that may not know is what the bill we're discussing actually does. So it chains tuition to CPI, and it also creates cohort pricing. So when you start as a freshman, you get the same all the way through. If you stay 4 years straight and graduate in 4 years and don't take breaks and all of those things. Do those provide you with a comfortable approach to this, or do you have different perspective on it?
I applaud the authors. I think that's a very, very pragmatic way to go about it. I think that gives predictability to the students coming in. I think tying it to inflation is fair. What we have been doing is we have been funding increases for salary, like a 2% increase. I know that some are warranted more. But essentially it provides some inflationary adjustment for costs, and also gives certainty to incoming freshmen as far as what the budget looks like for the next 4 years.
It also gives certainty to the universities themselves. So as a business, you can plan. I think that's really important that is lost in this conversation, is that the university is, in fact, a business that needs to plan.
Yeah, I agree with that as well.
Great. So we're here talking about this. You and I are largely in agreement on this. You can tell as we're talking. What misconceptions do you believe exist that we need to talk about?
Misconceptions on what front? As far as the public?
Yeah, in terms of the tuition freeze and whether or not it should be ongoing.
I don't know what misconceptions are there in the public realm. I think that there's still people that look at the overall amount of cash that the entity has, which is well over $1 billion, all funds included. But you have to have, and this is the way the human mind works, is when we hear numbers like billion, we think big, right? But it's relative to your size. I mean, we're talking about a system with dozens of campuses. It's the largest employer in the state, I believe, outside the U.S. Post Office and Walmart. We're definitely in the top 5. So you have to look at perspective of where we're at. So these are and this is every single level of government, and this is every single issue, is people are quick to come up with a very fast knee-jerk reaction as far as yes or no. And I think it's more complicated than that, and let's go down this rabbit hole. And some Republicans were annoyed I said this last year or 2 years ago, but Republicans have criticized progressive Democrats like Elizabeth Warren with the ideas that college should be free, right? And the reason for that is hey, it's your college, you should earn it. I would say as far as the student debt thing is that 30% of people have a college degree, 70% don't. So you're going to have 70% subsidize those that are the 30%. And by the way, if you have a college degree, you're going to make $900,000 more if you're a man, less. I think it's $200,000 less, $100,000 less if you're a woman. So you're going to have those individuals subsidize everyone else, right? Is that fair? But going back to the Republicans' criticize of the free tuition idea, which I also am skeptical of, is the natural extension of a tuition freeze forever is the same policy, just more slowly rolled out, right? Because, and not to bore everyone with the present value of annuity, but that's what, if you never increase anything, over time it dwindles down to nothing with inflation, right? On the flip side of that is progressive Democrats criticize that Republicans think that school should cost something. And I agree that there should be some equity in your school. I worked through school. I think it made me a better student. I was actually a C, occasional D, occasional B student in high school. I started working in the construction industry, and I went straight to a straight A student. I kid you not. I didn't make even the honors list, graduating high school, and then went to college, and it was mostly A's, some B's, because I was working for my school. So I think like there's middle ground here. There's a balance, and it's not a one size fits all. I mean, I think that Dale and Jennifer Kooyenga, who both have master's degrees, we'll find a way to pay for the school of our 4 kids. It's not easy. We're saving for it now. We'll find a way. But if you look at the child in the central city of a single mother, you can't make school so expensive that they can't afford it. Because I think there's a misconception of financial literacy is they get the final package like, well, here's your bottom sticker line price. What they don't see is all the debt that they're agreeing to that. So I think there's a disconnect with some students as far as what the true cost is and what they're putting on the credit card. And that is a huge problem across many different demographics as far as having that debt. And not really for those that are graduating. For most of them, it's the ones that never finish that really makes it tough to get back in that middle class.
Yeah, you're hitting on all of the right points here. You hit on so much that I have First, I want to say I think UW-Madison is really lucky to have private donors that have stepped up and made Bucky's tuition promise happen.
Yes,
so
that is huge.
You make $60,000 or less, you get free tuition for all 4 years. So I think UW-Madison has some great solutions to some of the challenges we're facing. And
I would point out that some of the tech colleges, like MITC, are doing that as well. Yep.
And I think the other thing that's really important to talk about as we're right here is the misperception on student debt, this national narrative driving this student debt conversation that just is not here in Wisconsin. So the data is telling us that graduates from UW-Madison, 53% have zero student debt. Those that do have less than $30,000 worth of debt. So certainly these narratives you hear on the national level where people are graduating with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, we're talking more about people who went to get their MBA or doctors or went to a private college, perhaps. We're not talking about state public schools here.
Right, exactly. I mean, there's no doubt that there's a problem. There's over $1 trillion in student debt nationally. But when you look at that, there's a large percentage of that. I think it's 30%. That's actually graduate students. And a lot of that's a lot of smaller than amounts too. So it's really going back to when you were talking about right now in the presidential campaign, you hear a lot of talk about canceling out the student debt crisis. I find it interesting just because when you look in the numbers, what you're going to see is that you're going to have people that dropped out of college that have this debt, or you're going to have people that are working that worked from 18 on. They're going to be subsidizing someone who has a medical MD or an MBA, or right. I mean, so once again, we go back to you're going to make nearly $1 million more if you graduate college. Should those people be subsidized from other people that decided not to go to college? So I mean, it's a tough issue. I get it, but I think UW-Madison should really be looked at almost like a national model where they're at now. Is the numbers coming out of UW-Madison as far as the debt that people come out of there with is just so manageable if it exists at all. I mean, 50% have zero. The rest of them now have a reputable degree, with very, very, very few have more than $30,000, $40,000 in debt. I mean, single digit. Now I'm talking about undergrad. But if you're talking about graduate school, you're talking about like the veterinarian school, the medical doctor school. Right. I mean, I don't know. I will tell you as a CPA, I don't know many medical doctors, or I've never seen a medical doctor that will retire from University of Wisconsin Medical School who will not be a millionaire. I know a millionaire today is not a millionaire what it was 20 years ago, but they will all be millionaires by the time they're 6 years old. So we just need to look at, I know it sounds like a lot of debt. I know, and I have many, many, many friends in this position where they're in their mid-30s still. They're out of medical school, and they're like, my student debt is more than my mortgage. But they punch through, and now they're in their 40s, and they're like making some pretty good bank with no student debt, and it catches up. But the numbers are jaw-dropping when you see a very sweet, a very nice 32, 33-year-old person who says, I have like $500,000 in student debt, but a good doctor, or many doctors are making well into 6 figures. Like that will, that they'll be able to pay that back. Yeah,
just nuance is so important in this conversation.
It is. And it comes down to like individuals. And that's what I love about when you have private sector people and not-for-profits stepping up and filling that void, not only from a financial perspective, but as you're talking about getting through school, part of that is the relationship business. And so I love that in our community, you have people stepping up next to these students, saying we're going to help you pay for school in that relationship and seeing that through. And so I think that's a big part of the success as well.
So there is an opposing package to deal with the tuition freeze in the legislature, but from the Democrats, and they are proposing that the state should fund the freeze. So the freeze should stay in place for students, and state dollars should make up the difference. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, there's so many assumptions in that idea. I mean, what is funding the freeze? I mean, are we assuming that we're going to continue to increase tuition, a 5-6% increase that we already saw? Is that reasonable? I mean, generally speaking, when you just say, hey, you decide what the increase is, we'll just write a check for it. There's very little accountability. There's less opportunity for innovation on that. I just think that that's a policy that just doesn't make sense. And also, we're not the federal government. We don't have a budget that does not have to be balanced. Every single state has to balance a budget. We have seen in the last just an incredible increase in Medicaid spending, incredible increase to the point of over $1 billion. Actually, I can give you the exact number here, but point is, we're seeing incredible increases in Medicaid spending. So Medicaid costs since 2011 have increased by $1.25 billion, 67%. So if you're talking about funding the freeze, as whatever that means, you're talking about where's it going to come from? Is it going to come from K through 12? Is it going to come from Medicaid? It can't, because we have a cost of maintenance. The federal government says you can't spend less on Medicaid. Are we going to raise taxes because we're actually already a high tax state and it's driving seniors away, making people less likely to start careers here? So, I mean, something has to give. And I think it's just a matter of branding. I mean, in the last budget, we did give $58 million more additional funding to UW system. We just gave that to the system saying, hey, and most of that money was just, here's money. We didn't say it's for tuition. It was just simply, no, it's not called funding the freeze. If you want to brand it as like funding the freeze, I know it's short of what they would argue it was, but there's money going to UW-Madison. And that's the whole UW system, by the way, the $57 million.
Yep. But
also $1.2 billion in capital budgets. So I just think that the opposing bill is too simple in nature. And I think that the bill that we're going to have a hearing on is more along the lines of something that would be more practical and have broader political support.
My concern with the fund the freeze approach is the predictability of it. So sure, maybe there's money in the next budget, but what about the budget after that?
Right.
Whereas this chaining tuition to CPI is this, again, it's the predictability that I think both the universities and families need.
Absolutely. I agree.
So what do you think? Can we get this bill through? What is your perspective on it?
To be totally honest and transparent, I think it's going to be a very, very tough sell this session. We're almost done with session for the year. Once again, I want to have a public discussion on it. I think we cannot keep the freeze in place for as long as the freeze has been in place. I will say that confidently. And I'm hoping that this is the first step to get some of my colleagues to start thinking about, okay, when are we done with this? What is the plan? And I think we need to have a plan. It's not something that happens in politics. It's a long strategic plan. My objective in hearing this bill is to have a bigger conversation going into the next budget is what should be the long-term policy. And I think the policy as presented in the bill, generally speaking, is a good pragmatic approach to moving forward with the proper balance between equity in your education and affordability.
So obviously Badgers United cares deeply about this. We're sitting here talking to you about it for 20 minutes now here. And we're here for the long haul. How do we stay involved? What's the best way for our listeners to stay involved in this conversation?
Well, I mean, first of all, know your stuff. Get in the details, get in the data, know it well. And then when you know it well, you should meet up with your legislator, especially your state reps. Like every state rep should meet with you if you ask for a meeting. State senators, it's a little bit more difficult. The area is 3 times as big, so you're almost representing 170, 180,000 people, but you could definitely meet with their staff. And if you get a big enough group together, you could definitely meet with your state senator. So, pull people together, get smart on the issue, and then very respectfully talk to your legislators, Republican or Democrat, on your position on this issue. If they're Democrats, my recommendation would be to approach it as far as, hey, we don't want to have no limits on this. Like we want to have some caps on this to keep it affordable, right? And if you're approaching Republican legislators, I would respectfully go the route of saying, hey, I appreciate your support for the freeze. Previously, it's been very helpful to my family and I, but as far as long-term sustainability, I really want you to consider looking at what this looks like going forward so that the quality of the education at the undergraduate level it maintains the quality that we have right now.
So as you bring up quality, I think we can pivot to some misconceptions about UW-Madison that we see out there. One of them is, recently we fell in the national research rankings from 6 to 8.
Yes.
Do you think that's something citizens should be worried about?
Well, yeah, it's definitely something we should be worried about. Now, how that relates to the conversation on tuition freeze, those are, I will almost say, a cheap shot. The amount and the ranking of University of Wisconsin-Madison's research programs are not related to undergraduate tuition. These are federal grants. These are grants from businesses. These are, as those that go to UW-Madison know, these are separate programs. These are separate pots of money. The state, just like nearly all 50 states, does very little funding of research. That's mostly federal and other sources. So as far as the ranking in the UW-Madison falling, absolutely. I know that the university is looking for new leadership in securing more grants from businesses on that front. That's very good. I'm glad that they're going that route. Competing for federal funds. And I also think that we got to look at what other schools have done that pass us up from 6 to 8 and see what they've done and why. So, I'm optimistic. There's also a timing element of stuff like this. I'm optimistic that UW-Madison will definitely stay in the top 10. But I would be disappointed they went to 9. I think they should be in the top 5. I think they're the best. I'm a little biased, but I think they're the best.
I might be biased too, just maybe a little. So we have a situation right now where President Cross is retired.
Yep.
And we're searching for a new president of the system. What do you think that search committee should be looking for as they're looking for a new leader? Innovation.
I would hate to see someone who's gone to their 4th or 5th university and has seen the same business models at every university. I would love to see new innovation as far as, pay it forward ideas, as far as new ideas of integrating the system with the community. I think that the university system as a whole could do a better job, and particularly UW-Madison could do a better job on the Wisconsin idea. Right here in Madison, you have Dane County has one of the highest percentage of college-educated people in the country. It's among the highest, and yet the educational outcomes for K through 12 Black men or boys is among the worst in the nation. That is shocking. You have one of the highest percentage of bachelor's degree counties, and then you have one of the lowest performing for minority students. That should absolutely be addressed. That should be part of the Wisconsin idea with one of the best universities in the world. That connection is not being made. So I think there's tons of opportunities for the university to do more. And although I'm proud of what the university system has done and is doing, I think the next university system leader has to have a broad spectrum of what is education. And as my kids have watched my wife just get her 3rd bachelor's degree, she was an accountant with myself, then she became a teacher, and she just got a nursing degree. So she was studying all last year. My Army career requires continuing education, so I was in a class last year studying Clausewitz and the art of war, and so I'm doing. So all 6 of us, from a kindergartner, a 2nd grader, a 4th grader, a 6th grader, a 6th grader, and my wife and myself, all doing homework around the kitchen table, all of us. The point is, education is something that you don't go through it and arrive. It's something that is part of our community, something that businesses are always learning from, or not-for-profits are always learning from. I would like to see a broader perspective in the university. I think Ray Cross has done a good job at that. I want to see the next president do a great job at that.
That's really interesting. What do you think they face as challenges, whoever walks into this role?
Well, I mean, the politicization of everything is so frustrating. I think there's a lack of diversity in universities across the country as far as people that are welcome to the free market, people that think that socialism has a lot to learn from as far as what not to do. There's not, and I really encourage, there's a UCLA law professor who had to write on why he deserved a merit increase, and one of those criteria he addressed, and it's the most beautifully written essay I've seen in a while as far as diversity across campuses when it comes to different political ideas. So I think the one of the challenges is just this not openness to ideas. And I know like some of the conservatives have thrown up another bill that we'll be hearing that same day is actually free speech on campuses. I think that's something that needs to be brought in culture by leadership. It can't be something that's legislated. And the reason it can't be legislated is because you can't legislate where people are on the spectrum. The spectrum is not a one-dimensional left or right. The spectrum is more like 3D. So what if I told you that there was someone who was for abortion rights, they were for criminal justice reform as a big priority for you, and they wanted to come speak at campus? You'd be like, we'd love to have that person. Well, that would be the Koch brothers. They're not pro-life, and they're very big into criminal justice reform. But they're big fans of free markets, and there's other issues that they're aligned more on the right with. Where do you put them on the political spectrum? So I think that, as much as legislators want to legislate a balance of ideas on a campus, it's really hard to legislate that. It has to be leadership saying, we're going to have diverse opinions. We're not going to shout each other down. We're going to look at that there are certain truths out there. There are truths out there, and we need to have conversations that respect and pursue the truth and have respectful dialogue. And I think that's not a challenge to UW system and UW-Madison. That's a challenge across our whole country right now that very much concerns me as a policymaker, as a father, as a just member of the community, as far as the lack of ideological diversity on our campuses.
That's really interesting, and I could talk to you all day about a lot of things.
I feel like we just podcast for like 10 hours on many different issues.
But is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up today?
No, just in general, I speak for myself, and I could speak for many of my colleagues. There's unfortunately tidbits in some Twitter feeds, like there's this that, Republicans don't like UW-Madison, and I would just say that is not the truth. We have tremendous respect for the mission of what UW-Madison has done, the UW system. It is one of the greatest assets of our state, and we are rooting for UW-Madison, and we want to work with the leadership and keep moving, that sounds cliche, but we'll keep moving Wisconsin forward and see how our public policies relate to the best interest of the state, to the best interest of the individuals in the state and the system itself. So there'll be many, many discussions on this front going forward, but I feel like the university is continue to be strong and will continue to be strong in the future. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Senator. It's been a real treat to have you here. Thank you very much. This has been an episode of Badgers United Podcast, the flagship, where we work with thought leaders in higher education to make sense of the complex policy web that governs our state's largest university. Please follow us on Twitter at Badgers_United, sign up for our mailing list on our website, badgersunited.org, and subscribe to the flagship wherever you get your podcasts.